The reverse wave of 1939 was an unheard of incident in the history of the Oregons, a blot on their record. But, in fact, this reverse wave was not large. It included about 1 to 2% of those who had been arrested but not yet convicted, who had not yet been sent away to far-off places, and had not yet perished. It was not large, but it was put to effective use. It was like giving back a kopeck change from a ruble, but it was necessary in order to heap all the blame on that dirty Yezhov, to strengthen the newcomer Beria, and to cause the leader himself to shine more brightly. With this kopeck, they skillfully drove the ruble right into the ground. After all, if they had sorted things out and freed some people, and even the newspapers wrote intrepidly about individual cases of persons who had been slandered, it meant that the rest of those arrested were indeed scoundrels, and those who returned kept silent. They had signed pledges not to speak out, they were mute with terror, and they were very few who knew even a little about the secrets of the archipelago. The distinction was, as before, Black Marias at night and demonstrations by day. And Black Marias, I learned, are the vehicles they used to drive around and arrest people in. I did not know. But for that matter, they soon took that kopeck back during those same years and via those same sections of the boundless Article 58, while who in 1940 noticed the wave of wives arrested for failure to renounce their husbands, and who in Tambov remembers that during that year of peace they arrested the entire jazz orchestra playing at the Modern Cinema Theater because they all turned out to be enemies of the people, and who noticed the 30,000 Czechs who in 1939 fled from occupied Czechoslovakia to their Slavic kinfolk in the USSR. It was impossible to guarantee that a single one of them was not a spy. They sent them all off to northern camps, and it was out of those camps that the Czechoslovak corps materialized during the war. And was it not indeed in 1939 that we reached out our helping hands to the West Ukrainians and the West Belarusians, and in 1940 to the Baltic states and to the Moldavians? It turned out that our brothers badly needed to be purged, and from them too flowed waves of social prophylaxis. They took those who were too independent, too influential, along with those who were too well-to-do, too intelligent, too noteworthy. They took particularly many Poles from the former Polish provinces. It was then the ill-fated Katyn was filled up, and then too that in the northern camps they stockpiled fodder for the future army of Sikorsky and Anders. They arrested officers everywhere. Thus the population was shaken up and forced into silence and left without any possible leaders or resistance. Thus it was that wisdom was instilled. That former ties and former friendships were cut off. Finland ceded its isthmus to us with zero population. Nevertheless, the removal of the resettlement of all persons with Finnish blood took place throughout Soviet Karelia and in Leningrad in 1940. We didn't notice that wavelet. We have no Finnish blood. In the Finnish War, we undertook our first experiment in convicting our war prisoners as traitors to the motherland. The first such experiment in human history. And would you believe it? We didn't notice. That was the rehearsal. Just at that moment, the war burst upon us, and with a massive retreat, and with it a massive retreat. It was essential everyone, to evacuate swiftly everyone who could be got out of the Western republics that were being abandoned to the enemy. In the rush, entire military units, regiments, aircraft, and artillery batteries were left behind intact in Lithuania, but they still managed to get out. Several thousand families of unreliable Lithuanians. 4,000 of them were subsequently turned over to be plundered by thieves in the camp at Krasnoyarsk. From June 23rd on, in Latvia and in Estonia, they speeded up the arrests, but the ground was burning under them, and they were forced to leave even faster. They forgot to take whole fortresses with them, like the one at Brest, but they did not forget to shoot down all political prisoners in their cells and courtyards of Lvov, Rovno, Tallinn, and many other Western prisons. In the Ch.2 prison, they shot 192 prisoners and threw their corpses down a well. How can one visualize it? You know nothing. The door of your cell opens and they shoot you. You cry out in your death agony, and there is no one to hear your cries or tell of them except the prison stones. They say, however, that there were some who weren't successfully finished off, and we may someday read a book about that too. In the rear, the first wartime wave was for those spreading rumors and panic. That was the language of a special degree. Outside the code issued for the first days of the war. This was just a trial bloodletting in order to maintain general state of tension. They gave everyone 10 years for it, but it was not considered part of Article 58, and therefore those few who survived the war time camps were amnestied in 1945. Then there was a wave of those who failed to turn in radio receivers or radio parts. For one radio tube found as a result of denunciation, they gave 10 years. Then there was a wave of Germans living on the Volga, colonists in the Ukraine and the North Caucasus, and all the Germans in general who lived anywhere in the Soviet Union. The determining factor here was blood, and even heroes of the Civil War and old members of the party who were German were sent off into exile. In essence, the exile of the Germans was similar to the dispossession of the Gulags, but it was less harsh since the Germans were allowed to take more of their possessions with them and were not sent off to such fatal, deadly areas. As had been the case with the Gulags, the German exile had no judicial basis. The criminal code itself was one thing, and the exile of hundreds of thousands of people was something else entirely. It was a personal edict of a monarch. In addition, this was his first experiment of the sort with an entire nationality, and he found it extremely interesting from a theoretical point of view. By the end of the summer of 1941, becoming bigger in the autumn, the wave of encircled was surging. These were the defenders of their native land, the very same warriors whom the cities had seen off to the front with bouquets and bands with a few months before, who had then sustained the heaviest tank assaults of the Germans, and in the general chaos, and through no fault of their own, had spent a certain time as isolated units, not in enemy imprisonment, not at all, but in temporary encirclement, and later had broken out. And instead of being given a brotherly embrace on their return, such as every other army in the world would have given them, instead of being given a chance to rest and to visit their families, and then return to their units. They were held on suspicion, disarmed, deprived of all rights, and taken away in groups to identification points and screening centers, where officers of the special branches started interrogating them, distrusting not only their every word but their very identity. Identification consisted of cross-questioning, confrontations, pitting the evidence of one against another. Afterwards, some of those who had been encircled were restored to their former names, ranks, and responsibilities and went off to military units. Others, fewer in number at the start, constituted the first wave of traitors of the motherland under 58(1)(b. But at first, until the standard penalty was finally determined, they got less than 10 years. That was how the active army was kept purged. But there was also an enormous inactive army in the Far East and in Mongolia. And it was the noble task of the special branches to keep that away from growing rusty, and for lack of anything to do, the heroes of the Khalkhin Gol and Kazan began to let their tongues wag, especially after they were permitted to examine the Degtyarev automatic pistols and the regimental mortars, which until then had been kept secret even from the Soviet soldiers. With such weapons in their hands, it was hard for them to understand why we were retreating in the west. With all Siberia and the Urals between them and European Russia, it was not easy for them to grasp that in retreating 70 miles a day, we were simply repeating the Kutuzov entrapment maneuver. Their compression could be helped along only by means of a wave from Eastern Army. At that point, lips tightened and faith became steely. It was obvious that a wave had also to roll in high places of those to blame for the retreat. After all, it was not the great strategist who was at fault. It was a small wave, just 100 men, the general's wave. They were in Moscow prisons by the summer of 1941, and in October of 1941, they were sent off on prisoner transport. Most of the generals were from the Air Force. Among them were Air Force Commander Smushkovich and General Petukin, who was known to have said, "If I had known, I would have first bombed out our dear father and then gone off to prison." And then there were others. The victory outside Moscow gave rise to a new wave, guilty Muscovites. Looking at things after the event, it turned out that those Muscovites who had not run away and who had not been evacuated, but had fearlessly remained in the threatened capital, which had been abandoned by the authorities, were by that very token under suspicion either of subverting governmental authority, 5810, or of staying on to await the Germans, 58-1A by 19, a wave which kept on providing fodder for the interrogators of Moscow and Leningrad right up until 1945. It need hardly be said that 5810 ASA anti-Soviet agitation never let up but hovered over the front and in the rear throughout the war. Sentences under 5810 were handed out to evacuees who talked about the horrors of the retreat, and it was clear from the newspapers that the retreat was proceeding according to plan. Those in the rear who were guilty of the slanderous rumor that rations were meager, to those at the front who were guilty of the slanderous rumor that the Germans had excellent equipment, and to those who in 1942 were guilty of the slanderous rumor that people were dying of starvation and in blockaded Leningrad. During that same year, after the disasters at Kerch, 120,000 prisoners, at Kharkov even more, and in the course of the big southern retreat to the Caucasus and the Volga, although another very important wave of officers and soldiers was pumped through. Those who refused to stand to the death and who retreated without permission, the men whom, in the words of Stalin's immortal order number 227, the motherland could not forgive for the shame they had caused her. This wave, however, never reached the Gulag. It accelerated processing by divisional tribunals. It was, to a man, herded into punishment battalions and was soaked up in the red sand of advanced positions, leaving not a trace. Thus was commented on the foundation of the Stalingrad victory, but it has found no place in the usual Russian history and exists only in the private history of the sewage system. Incidentally, we are here trying to identify one of those waves which came into the Gulag from the outside. There was, after all, an incessant internal recirculation from reservoir to reservoir through the system of so-called sentencing in camp, which was particularly rampant during the war years, but we were not considering those in this chapter. Conscientiousness requires that we recall also the reverse waves of wartime. The previously mentioned Czechs and Poles who were released, as well as criminals released for service on the front from 1943 on, when the war turned in our favor, there began the multi-million wave from the occupied territories and from Europe, which got larger every year up until 1946. Its two main divisions were: one, civilians who had lived under the Germans or among Germans, hung with the tenor under the letter A, 58-1A, military personnel who had been POWs who were nailed with a tenor under the letter B, 58-1B. Everyone living under the occupation wanted, of course, to survive, and therefore could not remain with hands folded, and therefore theoretically earned, along with his daily bread, a future sentence, if not for treason to the motherland, then at least for aiding and abetting the enemy. However, in actual practice, it was enough to note in the passport serial number that the person had been in occupied territory. To arrest all such persons would have been, from the economic point of view, irrational, because it would have depopulated such enormous areas. All that was required in order to heighten the general consciousness was to arrest a certain percentage of those guilty, those half guilty, those quarter guilty, and those who had hung on their foot cloths to dry on the same branch as the Germans. After all, even 1% of just 1 million fills up a dozen full-blood camps, and dismiss the thought that honorable participation in an underground anti-German organization would surely protect one from being arrested in this wave. More than one case proved this. For instance, there was the Kiev Komsomol member who the underground organization sent to serve in the Kiev police during the German occupation in order to obtain inside information. The boy kept the Komsomol honestly informed about everything, but when our forces arrived on the scene, he got his tenor because he couldn't, while serving in the police, fail to acquire some of the enemy's spirit or carry out some enemy orders. To those who were in Europe, who got the stiffish punishments of all, even though they were they went there as conscripted German slaves, that was because they had seen something of European life and could talk about it. And their stories, which made unpleasant listening for us, except of course for the travel notes of sensible writers, were especially unpleasant during the post-war years of ruin and disorganization. Not everyone, after all, was able to report that things in Europe were hopelessly bad and that it was absolutely impossible to live there. That also was the reason why they sentenced the majority of war prisoners. It was not simply because they had allowed themselves to be captured, particularly those POWs who had seen little more of the West than a German death camp. This was obvious from the fact that the interned persons were sentenced as severely as POWs. For example, during the first days of the war, one of our destroyers went aground on Swedish territory. Its crew proceeded to live freely in Sweden during all the rest of the war and in such comfort and plenty as they had never experienced before and would never experience again. The USSR retreated, attacked, starved, and died, while those scoundrels stuffed their neutral mugs. After the war, Sweden returned them to us along with the destroyer. Their treason to the motherland was indubitable, but somehow the case didn't get off the ground. They let them go their different ways and then pasted them with an anti-Soviet agitation for their lovely stories in praise of freedom and good eating in the capitalist Sweden. Within the all-over wave of those from formerly occupied areas, there followed, one after another, the quick and compact waves of the nationalities which had transgressed. In 1943, the Kalmyks, the Chechens, the English, and the Balkars. In 1944, the Crimean Tatars. They would not have been pushed out into eternal exile so energetically and swiftly had it not been that regular army units and military trucks were assigned to help the organs. The military units gallantly surrounded the alls or settlements, and within 24 hours, with the speed of a parachute attack, those who had nested there for centuries past found themselves removed to railroad stations, loaded by the trainload, and rushed off to Siberia, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and the Russian North. Within one day of their land and their property had been turned over to their heirs. What had happened to the Germans at the beginning of the war now happened to these nationalities. They were exiled solely on the basis of blood, and there was no filling out of questionnaires. Party members, heroes of labor, and heroes of the still unfinished were all sent off with the rest. During the last years of the war, of course, there was a wave of German criminals who were selected from the POW camps and transferred by court verdict to the jurisdiction of the Gulag. In 1945, even though the war with Japan didn't last 3 weeks, great numbers of Japanese war prisoners were raped for urgent construction projects in Siberia and Central Asia, and the same process of selecting war criminals for Gulag was carried out among them. And the end of 1944, when our army entered the Balkans, and especially in 1945, when it reached into Central Europe, a wave of Russian emigres flowed through the channels of the Gulag. Most were old men who had left there at the time of the revolution, but there were also young people who had grown up outside of Russia. They usually dragged off to the menfolk and left the women and children where they were. It is true that they did not take every one, but they took all those who, in the course of 25 years, had expressed even the mildest political views, or who had expressed them earlier during the revolution. They did not touch those who had lived a purely vegetable existence. The main waves came from Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. There were fewer from Austria and Germany. In the other countries of Eastern Europe, there were hardly any Russians, as if in response to 1945, a wave of emigres poured from the Manchuria too. Some of them were not arrested immediately. Entire families were encouraged to return to the homeland as free persons, but once back in Russia, they were separated and sent into exile or taken to prison. All during 1945 and 1946, a big wave of genuine, at long last, enemies of the Soviet government flowed into the archipelago. These were the Vlasov men, the Krasnov Cossacks, and Muslims from the national units created under Hitler. Some of them had acted out of conviction. Others had merely been merely involuntary participants. Along with them were seized not less than 1 million fugitives from the Soviet government, civilians of all ages and of both sexes who had been fortunate enough to find shelter on Allied territory, but who in 1946 and 1947 were perfidiously returned by Allied authorities in Soviet hands. A certain number of Poles, members of the Home Army, followers of Mikhailovich, arrived in the Gulag in 1945 via our prisons. There were a certain number of Romanians and Hungarians at war's end, and for many years after, there flowed uninterruptedly an abundant wave of Ukrainian nationalists, the Banderovsky. Against the background of this enormous post-war displacement of millions, few paid much attention to small waves as foreigners' girlfriends in 1946-47. In other words, Soviet girls who went out with foreigners. They sentenced these girls under Article 7.5, socially dangerous element. Spanish children, the same children who had been taken from their homeland during the Spanish Civil War, but who were adults by the end of World War II, raised in our boarding schools, they nonetheless fitted very poorly into our life. Many longed to go home. They too were given 735, socially dangerous element. And those who were particularly stubborn got 58-6, espionage on behalf of America. In fairness, we must not forget the brief reverse wave of priests in 1947. Yes, a miracle. For the first time in 30 years, they freed priests, but they didn't actually go about seeking them out in the camps. But whatever a priest was known to people in freedom, and whenever a name and exact location could be provided, the individual priests in question were sent out to freedom in order to strengthen the church, which at that time was being revived.